I'm Henny B, and welcome to the World War I Stories podcast, where history comes alive through the voices of those who lived it. Some scenes in these stories may be too graphic for sensitive listeners, so listener discretion is advised. Hooked on the podcast? Now you can hold the stories in your hands. World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, Volume 1 is now out on Amazon. 10 unforgettable tales of resilience, loss, and hope from the people forever changed by war. Available in paperback and on Kindle. Today's episode, The View from the Window. This was the most important part of her mornings. Day after day, as the house slept, she would slip out of bed and make her way towards the picture window that adorned the front parlor. From there, she would watch the sunrise. The land outside the window of the family apartment was flat and endless, as was much of Flanders. There was no mountains or hills to block the large orange orb that rose on the horizon day after day. At 17 years old and on the verge of adulthood, it was these simple moments that Elodie Durnez cherished. Like most mornings, she had risen well before the sun that day. She had ventured into the kitchen to put on a pot of coffee for her parents. She liked to have it ready when they awoke. However, as she walked past the window, she saw small specks of light in the distance. This odd sight caught her attention. They looked like lanterns. Were people hunting rabbits? Deer? It was fall after all, so it seemed like a feasible thing. Elodie and her family had moved to the small town of Ypres 3 years ago, and her father, as a well-respected watchmaker, would have been invited if it were a hunting party. But then she saw more than just a few. There were hundreds, all dotting the horizon, some stationary, and some swinging back and forth as if they were being carried. She must have stared for much longer than she had intended, for the sun started its steady climb over the horizon, and as it rose, a different picture started to emerge. They were lanterns after all, but the men using them were not hunters. They were soldiers. The more the sun rose, the more she saw. The tents, the vehicles, the men, and the artillery. She did not remember getting dressed. She did not remember putting on shoes. She did not remember leaving the apartment, descending the stairs, and walking outside towards the fields outside her window. But there she was. Somehow she had walked half a mile, perhaps more, until she reached the source of the lights. The place was alive with movement. Men hurried in every direction, tents half raised, wagons creaking under the weight of timber, shovels striking earth. Voices called out over the steady rhythm of work. She stood on a small rise, unsure what she was looking at. Some men carried wood towards the edge of a long earthen cut. Others hauled it back out again. A cart overturned, spilling sandbags into the mud. For a moment, she thought they were building something, perhaps a cellar or a storage pit. But then she saw them disappear, one after another, down a sloping ramp into the ground. Only it wasn't the ground at all. It was a trench. She saw a man nearby. He was in the powder blue uniform that she knew to be the French. He looked to be resting near a cook fire which was beginning to roar to life. She considered approaching him, but thought better of it. Instead, she walked along the cutout the soldiers had been disappearing into, following the ragged trench that had been cut into the earth. She had no idea how long she had walked when she reached the end, and that end was a new beginning, a trench system that stretched as far as she could see from her left and right. There she saw a flurry of activity, men with rifles scurrying up and down the trench system. She thought that maybe this is what it looks like in an anthill. A man from within the trench looked up at her. What are you doing here? Get your head down. His voice was tinged with panic. Why? She did not know. Like a jackrabbit running from a predator, he jumped out of the trench, grabbed her arm, and roughly threw her into the trench, jumping in after her. She landed on her backside in the bottom of the trench. Other soldiers stopped, looked at her, and giggled. Then they walked away. The soldier who threw her in stood over her. Who are you? Why are you here? This place is not for young women. She hastily got to her feet. Who are you? What's going on here? That's the better question. He pointed past her. We're at war, and about a mile that way is the German army. We're digging in to protect the town back there and to keep them out of France. If we can. Her hand shot to her mouth. The Germans? You have to leave here. In fact, if I were you, I would leave Ypres, he said matter-of-factly. She looked around the trench and her gaze stopped at the cutout entry that she had followed. He turned his head and saw the same. Yes, take that corridor. It'll lead you out and back to town. Just get out of here. We have no idea when the shooting will start, and when that happens... He paused and looked back towards the German lines. Not even I will want to be here. She did just that, her mind racing with what she had seen. Soldiers walking into the trench system looked her up and down as she ventured in the opposite direction. Back in her family's apartment, she prepared the coffee. The sound of artillery and gunfire became relentless. Sleep had become a stranger to Elodie and her parents. Often, her father, August, would stand at the window watching in silence with her mother, Celeste. There was a tenderness in those moments. They held each other and cried as men just a few miles away breathed their last. Elodie could often sit in her favorite chair and see the explosions reflected in the window. Who knew that carnage could be so beautiful from afar, she thought. Then the German shells started getting close. Too close. Like usual, she was up before her parents. They had hung sheets over the windows now. It was the only way to shield them from having to see the chaos that unfolded outside day after day. She started the coffee and sat in her chair. She attempted to read. It was a book by Maurice Maeterlinck called The Blue Bird, a story about wonder, hope, and light. It was a stark contrast to the darkness just outside the apartment walls. In the stillness of the morning, with the smell of coffee wafting through the air, she heard a faint whistling sound, and then an explosion that sounded closer than any before it. Quickly, she made her way to the window and pulled back the sheet. What she saw outside made her blood go cold. A building was on fire, just down the street. Her grandmother's building. What was that? She turned to see her parent standing in the doorway that led to their bedroom. It was her mother that had spoken. It's bad. It's all bad, was all she could muster as she ran out the door of the apartment. She ran through the corridor and to the stairs. She skipped stairs as she descended them, her bare feet slapping against the stone. She reached the first-floor landing and stormed to the front doors of the building. People had started to emerge from adjacent buildings, looky-loos who didn't realize, as she didn't, that they could be next. As she reached her grandmother's building, she stopped and stared at it. The building was engulfed in flames from top to bottom. There was no getting in, and most certainly no getting out. She heard some screams from within, but felt helpless. She had turned to stone, fear taking full control. "Mother," said the voice behind her. It took a moment for her to recognize that it was her father's voice. He had followed her out of the apartment, down the stairs, and to the streets. She turned to him, her eyes stinging with smoke and tears. She threw her head into his chest and felt his arms wrap around her, a small slice of comfort within the chaos that only a father could provide. Her grandmother was gone, and with her went the stories that kept the past alive, stories that stitched the family together through laughter and sorrow, She had told them often, her voice soft but steady, as if each memory were a thread she refused to let break. There were stories of Elodie's grandfather, who built a small textile business when they first settled in Ypres 35 years earlier. She could almost hear her grandmother describe the sound of the looms, the smell of oil and dye, and the rhythm of work that carried them through the years. There were lighter stories, too, ones that told of her father's childhood, of his mischievous ways, the scraped knees, and the trouble he always seemed to find. Those stories had made her father seem human, not just the cautious and wary man he had become. But there were other stories. Ones her grandmother spoke of quietly and only when pressed. Stories of the years her father had served under King Leopold in the Congo. She would speak of her worry, the long silences between letters, and the rumors that reached Belgium of cruelty and blood. Her grandmother never judged him for it. She only said that something dark had followed him home, something only he could ever understand. Now, that voice, that keeper of their family's light and shadow, was gone, and with it went the fragile bridge between memory and the fire burning before Elodie's eyes. "We have to go." "What?" she asked. The question had brought her back to the present. "It's only a matter of time before the Germans destroy this whole town. We have to go." And with that, he let go and walked back towards their building. She stood for a moment processing his words. "We have to leave?" she said to herself. She looked back at the burning building and realized that her father, as usual, was right. She never thought she would see the ocean, let alone the English Channel. Yet, as she stared at the vast blue water just outside the room they now rented in a Dunkirk boarding house, she was in awe. It was so beautiful, so majestic. The last 2 months had been a whirlwind. They had fled Ypres the very day her grandmother fell victim to the German shell. The road that led them out of Ypres and towards the town of Poperinghe was congested with others fleeing, and, as a result, they moved slowly, for one could only go as fast as those in front of them. When they reached Poperinghe, a town they had hoped would be a refuge, they found only more war. The streets were crowded with wounded warriors and wagons of supplies. The army had taken over, turning the town into a staging ground. They kept going. "We keep heading west," her father had said. "But that'll take us into France, and isn't that who the Germans are at war with?" asked her mother. "Yes, but the Germans aren't there now. It buys us time," he had responded. However, her father had been wrong. Some of the German army had already advanced into France, and even though not every town saw fighting, they all bore the remnants of war. To her father, a veteran of the atrocity in the Congo, it was not safe. Then Dunkirk, an oceanside town that invited them to stay. And stay they did. The salty November air was crisp as Elodie emerged from the townhouse she now shared with her husband René, a French soldier who had been wounded at Verdun and now worked for the Defense Ministry out of Dunkirk. She carried little Robert on her left hip as she made her way through the small side streets and towards the little cafe that her parents had purchased 2 years ago. The war had raged on throughout Europe over the last 4 years, but Dunkirk had been untouched. Father had first gotten a job at the watchmaker where he was able to teach the man a thing or two. Her mother had begun teaching at a local school, and Elodie had run the home until she had met René. As she looked down at her 2-year-old son, her thoughts returned to that day in the market when everything had quietly changed. She had been walking among the stalls, admiring the baskets of bread and vegetables, when she saw a man on crutches. He was wearing the familiar blue uniform of the French army. He was surrounded by children, all curious about the war and how he'd been injured. She had stopped to listen as he told a story. "Well, kids, this bum leg here happened by accident. I was running to get myself a canteen of water when I tripped on a board and fell. Balderdash, mister, one of the kids blurted out. Tell the truth. A Kraut did that, didn't they? Another asked. This caused him to laugh. Okay. I was climbing a tree trying to scout the German positions when he was interrupted by yet another child. You got shot, right? No. He paused for effect. I fell out of the darn tree. The kids began to disperse, obviously tired of his blatant untruths. One boy stopped and turned back to him. We just want to hear about the war. His voice had lowered just a bit. The kid probably didn't notice, but she did. No, you don't, kid. Trust me. In that moment, she could see something in his eyes. It was brief, but it was there. What was it? Was it sadness? Fear? Or had it been trauma? Walking up to him, she said, I like the way you handle those kids' questions. He shifted his balance on his crutches, and she saw he was looking her up and down as he did so. They're young and curious, to be sure. She held her hand out to him. Elodie Durnez. He put his weight on one crutch and reached out his hand. Renee Marchand. Pleased to meet you. I'm curious, too, she added. My parents own the coffee shop down the street. I'd love to hear about it sometime. Are you always so forward? He asked. He looked slightly embarrassed. I spend a lot of time there. Come in sometime. She had walked away then, and later that day, and for many days afterwards, he visited the cafe. Robert always got excited when he saw the cafe, and today was no different. As they approached the doors, he squirmed in her arms, a nonverbal plea to be let down. Once on the ground, he sprinted ahead, threw open the door, and ran inside. She laughed. Almost 4 years in Dunkirk. She was happy. When she entered, her mother already had Robert in her arms, carrying him behind the counter as if it were the most natural thing in the world. 4 customers sat in the shop, each absorbed in their cups and morning papers. None of them looked up or batted an eye at this small display of family closeness. Her father, August, emerged from the back room. Elodie, my love! He looked over at his wife and little Robert in her arms. And my Robert, there's my boy. One thing she had noticed about her parents over the last 2 years was how much they had changed. When the family had first come to Dunkirk, they had been quiet and reserved, almost broken. But now they had a cafe, a son-in-law, and a grandson. That had changed everything for them. Her mother Celeste was adept with her hands, with or without a toddler attached. She quickly prepared Elodie a cup of hot tea and set it on the counter. With honey, just how you like it. Scone? Robert asked, pointing to a display nearby. Celeste laughed and carried him over to pick one out. Elodie looked around the cafe. 3 years ago, it had been run by an older couple, the parents of the watchmaker her father had once worked for. When they decided to retire and relocate to Calais, the shop passed to their son Jacques, who had no interest in keeping it. August, however, did. He knew little about the business itself, but he was eager to learn, so he made a deal with Jacques. Elodie had been involved from the first day. She learned to make scones and other pastries, to press tea leaves and mix flavors, to brew coffee and order supplies. The cafe was a family affair. She had just kissed little Robert goodbye as her mother, Celeste, prepared to take him home when Renee burst through the door. Elodie looked at him quizzically. She noticed his eyes, bright, alive, practically dancing. They reminded her of the way he looked on the day they were married. Renee? She asked. August hurried from behind the counter. He always enjoyed seeing Renee. Renee, so good to see you. Come, sit, I'll make you some eggs. Celeste, struggling to manage Robert, finally let him down. You seem excited, Renee, she said. Picking up his rambunctious son, Renee's smile widened. It's over. What's over? Elodie asked. The war. They're going to sign an armistice in 2 days. The war is over. Germany has capitulated. Elodie's hands instinctively went to her mouth. Was this true? She ran to her husband and her son, throwing her arms around the two of them. She felt a tear on her cheek. It had come from Renee. She broke the embrace and looked at her mother. She had sat down in a chair near the door, her face the stone expression of a woman who did not know what to think at that moment. Then she looked at her father. He had bent over the counter and put his face in his hands. He was crying, loud and uncontrollable. Elodie then remembered that in all of the chaos leaving Ypres, her father never got the chance to mourn his mother. She guessed he was doing that now. She watched as her mother rose and made her way to him. The man who had been her rock through all the years of their marriage was now in need of one himself. She looked on as her mother laid a hand on his shoulder and gently lifted his face to hers. She wiped a tear from his cheek and pressed his head against her chest. The customers in the cafe, who had been just as excited as Renee and had been murmuring in eager tones, had now fallen silent, watching the moment unfold before them. She watched her father pull his head away from Celeste, and by the look in his eye, she knew what was coming next. August wiped tears from his face with the back of his hand, then straightened, his expression turning firm. "We have to go back." They closed the cafe for the first time since they had taken it over. Renee stayed behind with Robert, watching from the window as Elodie, August, and Celeste boarded the early morning train bound for Poperinghe. The journey was quiet, each of them lost in thought. The countryside rolled past in shades of gray and brown, the scars of war still visible in every field, many trees charred or stripped bare. When the train slowed and the conductor called out their stop, they gathered their things and stepped onto the platform. From there, the rest of the journey would be on foot. The air was cool, the road uneven, the silence of the landscape broken only by the distant cries of crows. As they walked, the signs of devastation deepened. Craters pocked the earth, trees were splintered and blackened. Villages that had once been full of life were nothing more than mounds of rubble and twisted iron. By the time they reached Ypres, the sun was low behind a veil of smoke and dust. The town they had once called home was in shambles. Buildings that had stood for centuries were now hollow shells. The Cloth Hall, the great church, the narrow streets where Elodie had walked just a few years ago, all broken. The air carried the smell of damp earth and ashes. They walked in silence, stepping over bricks and fallen beams. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. August had insisted that they visit his mother's building first. So they had. It was a pile of rubble now. Elodie guessed that more than one shell had hit the building over the past 4 years. She watched her father lay a wreath that they had picked up in Poperinghe. He climbed up on a pile of bricks and leaned it against a portion of a wall that was still intact. It was a gesture that, even though they knew it was coming, still made Celeste and Elodie cry. Still in silence, he motioned for them to continue, to walk amongst the broken streets and demolished buildings towards their former home. The debris made the walk, which would normally have taken 3 minutes, into 10. When they reached what was left of their old building, Celeste stopped first. The entire front half had collapsed, spilling outward onto the street. From where they stood, they could see the rooms that had once been their home, the furniture still there and somewhat recognizable from the street, the walls torn open to the sky. Celeste took Elodie's hand. For a long time, none of them moved. Then Elodie lifted her gaze upward again, and she noticed something that she thought was pretty remarkable. The window was still there, unbroken. The setting sun reflected back at them as if a war had never taken place. You've been listening to World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches. If this episode stayed with you, if it stirred something quiet or left you in stillness, share it, follow the show, leave a rating, help keep these stories alive. Our first collection now lives on Kindle. Search World War I Stories, Tales Beyond the Trenches, Volume 1 in your Kindle app, and carry these echoes with you. For glimpses behind the curtain and stories between the stories, join me on Instagram at WWIPod_HennyB. And if you'd like to see your name in the credits, become a producer. Visit our Patreon at patreon.com/World War I Stories and help power the next tale into existence. Thank you for walking back in time with me.